Welcome back. This is day 2 of your respiratory system. So today's aim is, how does the anatomy of the respiratory system allow it to function efficiently? So whenever you see this word anatomy, we're talking about the structures associated with something. So in this case, we're talking about the structures of the respiratory system, right? I'm sure you can name a few of these by now. We know about the trachea, we know about the lungs, we know about the bronchi, the alveoli, okay? So today we're talking about how each of these things allow the respiratory system to work and work correctly. All right, but before we get into that, you guys have got a do now question. So go ahead and pause this video, answer that question, and press play when you are ready to review it. All right, so this question says, humans breathe more rapidly during exercise than before because during exercise, the blood contains what? All right, well, what do we know about exercise? We know that when you exercise, you're using energy, right? Okay, and that energy is going to be in the form of ATP. So your muscle cells are constantly working and constantly needing more energy to function. But how do we make more energy? How do we make more ATP? Well, hopefully we know that that happens through this lovely little process called cellular respiration that allows our cells to produce energy. But we also know that in cellular respiration, something else is produced. Right? There are actually 2 extra products that are made, but this time we're going to be focusing on CO2. So CO2 is produced through cellular respiration in addition to ATP. Right? So if there's a lot of cellular respiration happening inside your cells, that means there's going to be a lot of CO2 in your cells as well that needs to be exhaled. So when you start breathing more rapidly, it serves 2 functions. First, it helps get that CO2 out of your body, so exhale CO2. But you also have to inhale more oxygen because we also need oxygen for cellular respiration to occur. Right? But the answer here is going to be A, the blood contains an increased level of carbon dioxide that you have to get out of your body. All right. There it is. I forgot to put an arrow in there. All right. First up, we've got a passage we need to read. As always, as I go through this passage with you guys, I want you to be annotating on your paper. So highlight anything that's important, write down any extra connections you can make to the content, and that will help you answer the questions that follow this passage. All right, so let's get to it. The human respiratory system is similar to the respiratory system of other mammals. Air moves through the nostrils into the nasal cavity, where tiny hairs and mucus trap dirt and other particles in the air. The air is also warmed, humidified, and tested for odor. The nasal cavity leads to the pharynx, where it meets air and food arriving from the mouth. Farther down the tube is the trachea, which is surrounded by rings of stiff cartilage that help maintain its tube-like shape, keeping it open for airflow. The trachea branches into 2 bronchi. Each bronchus leads to a lung. In the 2 lungs, the bronchi continue branching into smaller and smaller tubes called bronchioles. Most of these tubes are covered on the inside by mucus and tiny hair-like extensions called cilia. The cilia help keep the delicate tissues that line the lungs clean. When cilia are paralyzed by, for example, the harmful effects of cigarette smoking, oh, I've gotten behind on my highlighting, hold on. The lungs lose much of their ability to keep themselves clean. The tiniest bronchioles end in bunches of microscopic air sacs called the alveoli. It is the lining of the alveoli that acts as the respiratory surface. Blood vessels surround the alveoli. Hint, these are the smallest blood vessels. See if you can figure out which one it is. It is only when oxygen molecules diffuse across the lining from the alveoli into the blood vessels that they really enter the blood. All right. So now, using that information, I want you guys to pause this video, answer these questions, and press play when you're ready to go over it. The first thing we're going to do is track the movement of oxygen once it's inhaled. So when you breathe in oxygen, it can go in one of 2 ways. You can either go in through your mouth or go in through your nose. But both of those places are going to meet somewhere. Now, the place they're going to meet is actually a new word that we just read about in this passage. And that new word is describing this open space in the back of your throat where the nose and the mouth those passageways meet. And those passageways meet in something called the pharynx. So you can see that this pharynx is going to be this open space in the back of your throat where the nasal passageway and the mouth meet. Okay, now the pharynx is further up in the throat than the trachea is, because you can see that here we have the trachea, here we have the esophagus, but the pharynx is back up here at the top. So again, the pharynx is going to be that open space at the back of your neck where your nasal passageways and your mouth meet. Okay, so the first place it hits is the pharynx, but then if that air keeps moving through, it's going to eventually enter into the trachea. Okay, which you can see on both of these diagrams. That air is going to keep moving down that trachea and eventually enter one of two bronchi, which are then going to branch further into those root-like structures that extend throughout the lungs called the bronchioles. And then if you look at the very edge of those bronchioles, you'll find those little air sacs inside the lungs called the alveoli. And that is where gas exchange takes place. Okay, but what happens to cilia with constant smoking? So in that passage, you read that cilia are these hair-like extensions that line the surface of the bronchioles and line the surface of the lungs in order to keep those surfaces clean and free of debris. But once you start smoking, those cilia actually become paralyzed, which means that they can't move. And if they can't move, they aren't able to sweep the dirt and the debris and the mucus out of the lungs, which means they aren't cleaning themselves, and that debris is going to stay inside of your lungs. Okay, so here's a picture of what those cilia look like. Again, they are these tiny little hair-like extensions that line the surface of those cells, and they move like this in order to push all of that dirt, push that mucus out of the air passageways. But again, with constant smoking, the smoke paralyzes the cilia so they can't move, they can't clean those lung surfaces, and that dirt and that gunk just builds up inside of your lungs, which is quite disgusting if you really think about it. Oof. All right, now, number 3, this actually looks a little bit different on your paper, but the content is and the information is still the same. So I believe the 3 questions that are on your paper is what process allows CO2 to diffuse out of the capillaries and O2 to diffuse into the capillaries, something along those lines. Mine looks a little bit different, but it's still going to be the same information and we're going to work through it together, okay? So my question says, describe how gas exchange occurs in the alveoli. How does carbon dioxide move out and oxygen move into the capillaries? So in this image, again, we see this word called alveoli. And we know that those alveoli are going to be these little air sac structures that line, or we find them at the end of the bronchioles. And if you zoom in really closely, they look something like this. So you might see them represented one of 2 ways. And again, these are those air sacs where gas exchange occurs. So in this picture, we see an alveoli, and we also see a blood vessel. Hint, it's the smallest blood vessel. Hopefully you figured out earlier that this is going to be an example of a capillary. Okay, so I'll write that down. This is a capillary. That is our smallest blood vessel. Okay, and we see that the alveoli and the capillary are really close together. And they have to be close together because a certain process is about to happen. Let's figure out what that process is. So we know that we find those alveoli in the lungs, which means that oxygen is going to be flowing into them. So O2 in from lungs, which means that we're going to have a pretty high concentration of oxygen in the alveoli. Okay, but we also see that in these capillaries rather, the blood coming in is represented as blue. Now, typically when we see blood represented as blue in diagrams, I told you guys that that represents deoxygenated blood, which means that it contains a high amount of CO2. So in these capillaries that push up against the alveoli, you see that we actually have a high concentration of CO2. Right? So what do we know about molecules when there's an unequal concentration? Well, they're going to want to flow to achieve equilibrium. So this high concentration of oxygen that we see inside the alveoli is going to move into the capillaries. And this high amount of CO2 that we see in the capillaries is going to move into the alveoli. So it can eventually move back through those alveoli, head up to your lungs, and be exhaled. Exhale CO2. But how do these molecules cross the cell membrane? If we're going from high to low concentration across the cell membrane, think back to Unit 4. What word do we know that describes the movement of molecules from high to low concentration? These molecules are going to be moving through diffusion. Right? So the answer that is on my screen is diffusion occurs when molecules move from high to low concentration. We see that CO2 is high in the blood vessels over here and moves into the alveoli. And we also see that oxygen is high in the alveoli, and so it's going to diffuse or move into the blood vessels. Now, the third question that's on your paper, I believe, is where does diffusion occur? Where do these molecules move? Oh, it's where does gas exchange occur? I knew it. Where does gas exchange occur? And that, of course, is going to be gas exchange occurs in both the alveoli and the capillaries. And diffusion has to happen in order to move those substances across the cell membrane. Right? So gas exchange, again, is when we're swapping O2 and CO2. And we see that this is happening in the alveoli as well as the capillaries. Those have to work together in order to balance the concentrations of oxygen and CO2 in our body. All right, now the last thing we're gonna go over today is the diaphragm. So I've briefly mentioned the diaphragm, okay? We know it's that muscle that's found along the bottom of your lungs, and it's inside of your rib cage, but how does this relate to respiration? What do we need to know about it? Well, let's find out. So again, as I read through this small passage, annotate anything that you think is important, and then we're gonna use that to figure out what do we feel in here? So breathing is the movement of air into and out of the lungs. Surprisingly, there are no muscles connected to the lungs. The force that drives air into the lungs comes from ordinary air pressure. So how does the body use this force to inflate the lungs? The lungs are sealed into two sacs called the pleural membranes, which are found inside the chest cavity. And at the bottom of that cavity is a large flat muscle known as the diaphragm. Okay, so this diaphragm is found right here. Again, it's pretty hard to see because, again, it is a flat muscle. This singular line right here represents the diaphragm. So how does this help us breathe? Well, during inhalation, the diaphragm is going to contract. Remember, the diaphragm is a muscle, so it can contract. And when it contracts, it moves down. So this diaphragm is going to contract, moving down. And when this happens, it allows air or oxygen to flow into your lungs. Okay, but during exhalation, so when you breathe out, the diaphragm is going to curve. As you see right here, it curves up, which moves that diaphragm up and pushes air out of your lungs. Okay, so then CO2 moves out. So this final bullet point you need to fill in is that air moves in and out due to these pressure changes that we see. So this essentially is one big physics problem, which when you get to physics will make a little bit more sense. But that diaphragm is the reason that air is able to move in and out of your lungs. So thank you, diaphragm, for allowing us to breathe. Oh, I forgot we've got one more thing. I lied. This is the last thing we need to do today. Okay, and that is malfunctions of the respiratory system. So what are some diseases we need to know? Well, these are going to be some pretty familiar diseases. In fact, some of you guys might have these. So cigarette smoking causes many deaths from respiratory diseases. Evidence has shown that the chemicals in tobacco smoke can cause cancer in the lungs, esophagus, larynx, and mouth. Other diseases of the respiratory system which smokers are more likely to get include the first thing called bronchitis. Some of you guys may have had bronchitis before, and this is going to be an inflammation and swelling of the inside of the bronchial tubes. So whenever you see this suffix, itis, it's referring to inflammation or swelling. So it means that something is swelling. But in this case, we're talking about the bronchial tubes, right? We're talking about the bronchioles are swelling or they're inflamed. So how does bronchitis disrupt the flow of air in and out of our bodies? I want you guys to answer that question on your own, then press play to check your answer. So how does bronchitis disrupt the flow? Well, if the bronchioles swell up, air can't reach the alveoli. Remember, if you look back at your diagram we saw earlier, those bronchioles connect directly to the alveoli, which is where gas exchange occurs. But if air can't fit through those bronchioles, it can't reach the alveoli, and gas exchange is going to be hindered. Right? The second disease you need to know is something called asthma. Asthma is a little bit different from bronchitis. This is when the walls of the bronchi contract, which is going to restrict the flow of air. So as a result, the lungs do not fill or empty normally. But how is asthma different from bronchitis? Okay, so pause this video, take a look at those two definitions and figure out how are these two different? Okay, hopefully you got that asthma occurs when the bronchi contract, but bronchitis occurs when bronchioles swell. So they're similar, but they're ultimately very different diseases. All right, and the last thing we need to know about is something called emphysema. Now, this is a very serious chronic disease in which the alveoli break down, which is going to reduce the total area of the respiratory surface. Again, this is where gas exchange takes place. So if your alveoli aren't working, gas exchange can't happen. And there's going to be some serious problems associated with that. So now, how would the breakdown of the alveoli impact the respiratory system? Again, pause this video, answer it on your own, and then press play to review it. Well, how would the breakdown of alveoli impact the respiratory system? The breakdown of the alveoli is going to result in less room for gas exchange. Remember, we're talking about the exchange of oxygen and CO2. So if this gas exchange can't occur properly, you're not going to get as much oxygen flow into your body, and you're not going to be able to remove that CO2 as efficiently. So it's going to cause some serious, serious problems in the long run for you. Right, now I've got some pictures of what each of these look like. So here we see bronchitis. Remember, that's the swelling of the bronchial tubes. So swelling of bronchioles. We can see here's a normal bronchiole. Okay, but here is that swollen or inflamed bronchial tube. We see that there's not quite as much room for the air to flow through because that wall is swollen, right? Now here is same picture. We see the bronchiole of a person with asthma. You can see that these muscles in a normal bronchiole or bronchi are relaxed, but in asthma, those muscles close, they contract. Okay, let's write down that word contract. Those muscles contract and physically close the airways shut. Okay, so you see this is a clogged airway, which again is going to reduce the amount of air that can flow through those passageways. And then finally here on the left or the right, I'm not sure what happened to the size of this picture, but it is a little bit messed up. This is going to be an example of an alveoli with emphysema. So on the left, we have the normal alveoli. If this picture were normal, you would see just those regular air sacs. Remember, I always draw them in green for whatever reason. But on this picture on the right with emphysema, those air sacs look kind of deflated. And they don't look like they're going to be able to hold much air inside of them. Because of that, these are damaged. They're not going to work as properly. So again, gas exchange is going to be hindered. Hindered. Because not as much, oh, why can't I fit my last D? There it is. Oxygen can't flow in as efficiently and CO2 can't flow out as efficiently if these alveoli are damaged. Okay, that is the last thing I have for you today. It's the official last thing. So go ahead and submit these notes and your exit ticket on Google Classroom. And if you have any questions, let me know on Remind. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you guys soon.